Hello, good morning everybody, and thank you for joining us here today. We are gathered here today on the territory of the signatories of Treaty 7, and I acknowledge the Métis people who share a deep and abiding connection to this land. We are gathered here at Mulkinsis, at the connection of the elbow and the bow. I'm Ceci, an NDP Municipal Affairs critic and MLA for this area, Calgary, Buffalo. And I'm joined here today by my good colleague, Heather Sweet, NDP critic for Agriculture, Forestry and Rural Economic Development, and the MLA for Edmonton Manning, if I recall. And today we are here to highlight how, once again, this UCP government, distracted and focused on their own internal drama, is failing to support Alberta communities and families both in this budget and in the long term. By next year, this government will not be spending money on climate resiliency projects. They will take that funding envelope for climate resiliency projects from $50 million annually to zero. And they're doing this at a time when we see increasing extreme weather events and natural disasters. And it's only likely to get worse. A report last month from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicted further devastation and disruption from serious weather events. As well, the Insurance Bureau of Canada reported that 6 of the top 10 costliest natural disasters occurred right here in Alberta. And you know them all. In 2016, the Fort McMurray fire. In 2013, the Alberta floods, which affected Canmore and Calgary and downstream High River. The 2020 Fort McMurray floods, the 2010 Slave Lake fire, the 2012 windstorm and rainstorm in Calgary, and just a couple years ago, the 2020 Calgary hailstorm that impacted so many of my colleague Irfan Sabir's constituents. We are likely to see more short-term effects of climate change, not fewer, going forward. Cutting funding for climate resiliency is incompetent, it's short-sighted, and will leave Albertans and communities where they work and raise families in jeopardy. Alberta municipalities are worried about this also. I've heard from many of them. They're looking to the province for leadership as we adapt to the changing climate. They don't have the funding to tackle such a massive issue on their own. Even then, it's worth noting that the province is also cutting the Municipal Sustainability Initiative, or MSI funding that helped the City of Calgary do so much in the East Village. If you look around, the East Village is building up now. A lot of that was MSI funding as well as CRL. Calgarians get the importance of building resilient communities. The City of Calgary has for years got the importance of that, and the City of Calgary has a plan to invest in climate resiliency. And just coming from the downtown Sheraton Hotel area to here, there are climate resiliency projects all along the Bow River with huge steel kind of pushed into the ground to keep the river in the river and not let it, when it floods, come over the bank or come through the ground and banks into the Chinatown area. And what gets worse is, as the province has already changed the disaster recovery program, in the past it's been used to help people and communities from recovering from disasters. Albertans now will only be able to access that program once. For anyone hit multiple times by flood or other disasters, there'll be no funding available from the province of Alberta. The government won't lift a finger to help any of those people out. This is wrong, and it's reflective of a pattern that this government is leaving communities high and dry, or wet and hit by hailstorms. Since taking office, the UCP has torn up partnerships with municipalities, downloaded costs onto them, and dragged its feet on major investment projects. And now it's cutting the funding they need, those communities need, to make their communities resilient and to keep their economies up and running. Albertans and Calgarians simply cannot trust this UCP government to stand up for them. And now I'm happy to turn things over to Heather Sweet, who's going to talk more. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for having me here today in Calgary, Buffalo, your constituency. It's absolutely beautiful down here. Senseless cuts like these are a direct attack on families, communities, and the economy of rural Alberta. Rural communities and rural families have seen firsthand the impact of climate change, from wildfires, droughts, floods, extreme weather events, and more. The UCP talk a lot about rural communities and how they're the economic heart of Alberta. But when it really comes to walking the talk, this government's nowhere to be found. This government was slow to respond to the drought crisis that hammered farmers and ranchers, hurting our economy in rural Alberta. They have repeatedly stalled on major projects that are good for our local economies. And now we see they're going to literally remove the funding to keep communities protected from the harmful impacts of climate change. Alberta communities rely heavily on provincial funding to build berms, to prevent flooding, to fireproof communities, and to do flood mitigation as well as looking at drought prevention. Cutting this funding is incompetent, it's short-sighted, and it's bad for the economy. The impact of not acting now will cost our province more in the long term. More insignificant damages, job losses, and of course the economic impact of our commodities. We are here today calling for the UCP to give their heads a shake, evaluate their priorities, listen to what rural Albertans are actually telling them, and reverse their cuts to the climate resiliency programs. The budget is passed, but the government can still act. We'd be more than happy to expedite passage of a supplemental funding bill that could go through the legislature, because our communities are too important to the people that call them home, and important to our local economies. All the way from here in Calgary, Buffalo, to obviously farms in Lethbridge and Tabor, up north to Grand Prairie, to our oil sands. Let's reverse these cuts. Let's protect Alberta communities. The government must act to make sure our communities are protected and our economy can keep running forward. Thank you.
Questions?
Questions?
Yeah, we're happy to take your questions.
We'll do some questions here in person. Seeing none, so we'll turn it over to the phone line. Reminder, if you're on Zoom, to use the raise hand function, and if you're joining us by phone, you can press *9 to join the question queue. I'll give everyone a moment to join the question queue. First question is from Catherine Grakowski. Catherine, I'm just going to unmute you now, so you should be able to open your line and ask your question. Go ahead.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit what's at stake by eliminating this program. I mean, there's other ways that the government could fund projects like flood protection and that sort of thing. What's at stake by getting rid of this program specifically?
So the $50 million that would be cut out of the program, what we've seen those programs be used for historically and would be used going forward is exactly where we are today. So the flood programming that was funded and the evaluations to help support Calgary after the flood was funded through this program. We see the same thing in Edmonton with the Saskatchewan River, as well as some of the smaller municipal communities in rural Alberta have also accessed this funding to look at how to address whether it be flood prevention or drought management. Those programs now, those grants that were provided to those municipalities will no longer be provided under this program, which will have a direct impact on how we're planning to move forward. I think when you're looking at what's happened in BC, even last year, with the massive flooding that happened and forest fires, we need to start taking this very seriously. And when a government decides to start cutting funding that directly supports municipalities to do that proactive planning, it is a disservice to the people of this province, but also to the future of our economy.
Catherine, did you have a follow-up question today?
Yeah, if I guess understanding how this program worked. Did municipalities get all their funding for the entirety of the project when the grant was announced, or was it a multi-year? Like, is there any project that has previously been announced that would have not get their full funding because this program has been cut to zero?
So these would be ongoing grants that would have been, the municipalities would have accessed. So again, it would have been setting up an assessment to determine what kind of project. So again, where we are today, that assessment would have been completed to look at how to reinforce the riverbanks for the flooding. And then obviously a discussion with the province would have continued around what that funding programs would have looked like. It's also something to be aware of is that this funding was also used for payments to help support loss to communities when these disasters occurred. So Fort McMurray would be a prime example. When the flooding happened, and Fort McMurray is still struggling with trying to get insurance payouts to support the local communities, this money was used for that as well. And as Joe said in his remarks, that is now going to be a one-time thing. Which will have negative impacts on communities that aren't being able to prepare for the climate concerns that may be coming forward. So this money needs to be put back into the budget to support communities to be resilient when it comes to climate events.
All right, another call for questions. Reminder for those on Zoom to use the raise hand function, and those joining us on the phone to press star 9. I'll give you a moment. If you'd like to ask a question, you can indicate that now. Seeing no more questions today, so this will conclude the press conference for today. Thank you, everyone. Have a good Sunday.
Thank you.
Tens of thousands of Albertans have already provided their idea for how we can build Alberta's future. You can too by going to albertasfuture.ca.